The New Orleans Conference, the world's greatest investment event.
Thank you. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Greenspan. I will not be following the biography listed in your program book, so if you want to read more about him, you can read it there. I want to show you his two books. One I will be using quite often in the interview is called The Age of Turbulence, Adventures in a New World. It's a full-life memoir. And then the more recent book, which came out last October and is now coming out next week in version 2.0, called The Map and the Territory, which contains a full chapter on China and gold. I'm going to talk to you about all stages of Alan Greenspan's life and then join him over for a chat. And I'm going to talk to you about the Federal Reserve years, the Social Security Commission, the Council of Economic Advisors. But I'm going to begin with the fact that Alan Greenspan's mother was named Goldsmith, and his uncle changed his name to Mario Silva. So we have all the elements we want to discuss right there: green, gold, and Silva. And we intend to discuss all three. He began life as a saxophone player. His mother's side was quite musical. Like me, he learned that music is not a great way to earn a living. But last night he went down memory lane to the Roosevelt Hotel, Fairmont. It was once called Blue Room, where he and the big bands played in the 1940s. So that's another trip down memory lane. And now we're going to start with the important questions about gold and money. In the late 50s, early 60s, Alan Greenspan joined Ayn Rand's inner circle they comically called the Collective, since they were all against collective behavior and were quite individualistic. And he wrote a piece on gold in the 60s. Have any of you recall that piece that he wrote as part of the Ayn Rand group? It's some of the best and hardcore, purest gold standard defense possible. So as I make my way over there, I want to ask Alan Greenspan once again what it was like being with Ayn Rand in the 60s and the gold paper you wrote. Do you have any background on that you'd like to share? Here we are.
Wherever that is.
What was Ayn Rand like personally, and what did you learn from her when you were in that collective?
Well, you have to understand, I came to it as sort of what is called a logical positivist philosophy, which essentially is highly pragmatic. That is, if you can't demonstrate it, it isn't so. And the result of that is that all issues of emotions and values, human values, were by definition irrational, not worthy of analysis. This was the philosophy which essentially came out of the Manhattan Project, where large numbers of scientists created essentially their own philosophy. And my first meeting of Ayn Rand, we got into a very interesting discussion in which she said to me, as I understand it, you can't be really sure unless something is demonstrably the case, factually. And I said, and she asked me, well, are you sure of your existence? And I said, no, not really. And to whom am I speaking? Well, what that contradiction showed me is that the whole edifice of the views that I held really was not rational. It was essentially a contradiction to reason. And if anything about Ayn Rand is that reason was everything. And it was a remarkable ability. She basically taught me how to restart my engines of how to evaluate human nature, which really it wasn't until this latest book where I finally acknowledged that there are such things as in the rational context, animal spirits which could be analyzed. And the result of it is her influence has been fairly well evident to me, incidentally, going all the way back to the beginning and through the day she died.
Well, in your book, you mentioned you left Ayn Rand's circle to help the Nixon campaign, but you didn't work for him. You worked for Gerald Ford as head of the Council of Economic Advisors and were sworn in with Ayn Rand at your side. And I wanted to quote one item from your book. You said you left the world of theoretical philosophy and economics and entered the arena of action so that you could not be just a pamphleteer on the sideline, but a part of the action. Could I ask you, in what way did your objectivist teaching in Ayn Rand and belief in the gold standard influence the people you were around? How did you get them to compromise into some of your values, or did you feel like most of the compromise was you had to go their way?
Well, it all started when I got into the Nixon campaign. It was Martin Anderson, whom I originally met in an Ayn Rand seminar, and he and I got to know each other very well. He was a professor, a finance professor at Columbia, and we were writing a book together where I was doing the theoretical economics and he, the professor, was doing the practical stuff. Mm-hmm. And finally, when he called me up and said, we need help in this campaign because Anderson had gotten called in by Nixon because he had produced a book called The Federal Bulldozer, which was essentially a fairly excellent analysis of what was wrong with certain types of government operations. And so he got me involved there, and I started off, and the first thing they assigned me to do is, can you write us a speech on agricultural subsidies? And I said, I certainly can. Well, I wrote a really quite thoughtful speech on why agricultural subsidies made no sense to the farmers in the long run. And a couple of people in the Nixon campaign liked it, and they passed it around, including to two Republican senators from Nebraska who thought it was awful. And I learned a very major lesson right at that particular point, but it really was fascinating to see the difference between actually implementing the values you hold as best you can in the context of the political system, which has got, shall I say, flaws, to say the least. But lots of things were done, I thought, importantly. I never changed my fundamental philosophy, but I did change how I behaved in the world of trying to get things done. And the one thing I was quite pleased with is I never actually changed any of my views, because my views were rational, and if they're rational, change them to what? But I couldn't work in today's world. I mean, I would not know what to do with policy at this particular stage, in the sense that the types of decisions you make. I know what's going on, obviously, but it's a very different world from the one I worked for Reagan, for example, and Reagan said, once to me, he said, Alan, there's certain fundamental principles which we all adhere to, which is essentially the Bill of Rights. Everyone who lives in the United States believes in the Bill of Rights. And if they didn't, they leave. But everything else has got to be compromised, or you cannot have the law of the land, you cannot have anything which actually creates how the system works. And even our Constitution has got much of that in it. But I soon learned that it, it matters where you come from, and it matters how hard you push. And I don't know, I was in government for 20 years by accident. I mean, I was a private sector person, quintessentially. But I must admit, it's very interesting to see if you can change the world, and I think I did to a certain extent.
Well, let me ask you about one specific policy you were deeply involved in the Reagan years. First year, he appointed you chair of the Social Security Reform Committee. And I always wondered why there wasn't a privatization option then, like Chile was having at the same time with the Chicago boys, Milton Friedman's school. But then when I read your book, I realized it was very political. There were 15 people on the panel, including people like Claude Pepper, who would not compromise an inch, and Tip O'Neill and Bob Dole, both parties. And I don't imagine any of those people wanted to compromise an inch. So I have a secondary question. Why wasn't there a minority report, which maybe you could write or somebody else could write, about the privatization of Social Security?
Well, because there were no minority reports. But what we could do, which is what Reagan wanted us to do, is to demonstrate that unless something rational was done with respect to funding the Social Security, the issue is this, that you can argue Social Security as an issue as to whether or not it even should exist in one form or another. But you can't argue that once you decide that it exists, not to fund it, because that's printing money, which ultimately, in any regime, falls apart. So my basic view was that what we decided to do is to basically, we had a fairly good staff, and we had some fairly good people operating on it, and I thought the report that actually came out was about as good as you could get, given what Reagan was trying to do.
Well, later on, you intersected the same subject in 2005 when President George W. Bush was floating the balloon of privatization of Social Security. And I believe you supported him at that time, and both of you came under heavy criticism for even bringing up the subject at that point. Was it like the third rail? You got electrocuted again?
Well, if you touch it, it is.
Yeah.
But look, no, I've always been in favor of privatizing the whole private pension system. Mm-hmm. Because, for lots of reasons, which I think you're all aware of. But I would say in today's political world, and in the political world back then, it was just actually impossible. And the question was, can you incrementally change the world in that sense? And I don't think so. I think you have to have some form of crisis, like, well, I mean, Reagan got in as a result of a crisis, which was basically a collapse under Jimmy Carter. Margaret Thatcher, very similarly. In other words, you need something of that nature to occur, and I don't think that you can just basically go forward with a privatization scheme, which makes all the sense in the world, but there are so many people receiving benefits which would be extraordinarily difficult to get them weaned off them.
Right, let's move into your Federal Reserve years now to be the core of our discussion. When you took office in August of 1987, fortuitously right before a big crash, but the Fed funds rate was over 10%. It was pretty high, and you brought it down over your years quite a bit. Gold was fairly high. It was $460 on your first day, and gold peaked at $504 in December of 87. And over the next 12 years, when you were in the Fed chair, it was cut in half to 252 by August of 1999. One of your statements in your book is that even though a gold standard is not practical, you still believe in the theory of a gold standard, but it's not practical for a welfare state. You wanted to manage...
No, it's not practical. It's not possible.
Okay. You wanted to manage Federal Reserve policy as if, or to simulate a gold standard. So gold was going down, and that, in a sense, is good, means your policies were not inflationary. However, there are many here who believe that during that time, the Fed must have been selling gold or entering the market or manipulating the market in some ways to push the price of gold down. Was anything like that happening under your guidance?
No, in fact, the only issue that is involved was, in fact, that central banks were major sellers of gold in that particular period. And the United States abstained from the so-called cartel to decide who sells what. In other words, they were mainly concerned about if all the central banks sold gold at the same time, they'd really drive the price down. Mm-hmm. So they set up a partitioning scheme where individual central banks were given quotas, which they could sell at certain times. And the United States abstained. We said no. And there was, I think you'll find it in the new book, which will be out next week, I discuss a issue of what went on when the issue came up as to why doesn't the United States sell all of its gold? What good does it do? And there was a big debate that went on in Jerry Ford's administration, and the answer that came out was they couldn't quite figure out why, but gold is essential for reserve balances. And what people don't realize at the moment is that central banks own a very large chunk of gold. If it's the barbarous relic, if it earns nothing and it costs money to store it, why are central banks holding it, where virtually every single one of them holds gold? And indeed, the pact that was put together with the Europeans, essentially, to sell gold was renewed earlier this year. So there's a fascinating question here. If gold is not relevant to anything, what in the world are they doing?
Well, that's a question I was going to ask you. Ron Paul asked Ben Bernanke in congressional testimony recently the simple three-word question, of which you got a one-word answer. Let me try it on you. Is gold money?
It's currency, of course. In fact, it and to a lesser extent silver are the only major currencies which have intrinsic value, meaning that you don't need a third party to essentially authorize or guarantee it. And it acts as though it's sort of inbred in human nature, but it can't be. And there's no reason why you say that there's something about gold which mesmerizes the human soul or something like that. It isn't. But it has a history going back as far back as you can reach, where gold has always been accepted without reference to any other guarantee. For example, Germany could not import any goods in the latter part of World War II, as World War II was winding down and Germany was losing the war, unless the Germans paid in gold. And the notion of China buying gold now, as I go into some detail in the book, is my suspicion as to what they would really like to do is to convert part at least, of their $4 trillion reserve balances, which is about 2/3 of that is US dollars, into gold, because I think they're beginning to recognize that there's a certain power that gold has which fiat currencies have never reached, will never reach.
Right.
And indeed, that's occurred many
And it is
times.
the only commodity besides currency. And by the way, Bernanke's answer was no. Is gold money? He said no. You can get this on YouTube. So Ron Paul followed up and said, why then do central banks hold gold instead of something equally valuable, say diamonds? Bernanke's answer was tradition. Why would you say that gold is the only commodity held by governments in place of?
Tradition is fine, but you lose money by holding gold because it costs stuff, it costs storage, and you're foregoing interest received. It's a fascinating question, and the debate that I discuss in the new book, which essentially occurred between Bill Simon, who was Treasury Secretary in the early 1970s under Jerry Ford, and Arthur Burns, who was then chairman of the Fed, where Burns was saying that it's the ultimate form of payment. We have to hold a certain response. And Bill Simon echoing what actually Milton Friedman held. Milton Friedman was not a fan of gold. He acknowledged the fact, as did everybody else, that it worked remarkably well in the period 1870 through 1913.
Right.
It's even John Maynard Keynes, who subsequently called it a barbarous relic, considered gold value. I mean, the system worked, and it did work. The reason it broke down was that World War I so reorganized the relative competitive international positions of various major countries around the world that you couldn't go back to the parities which were set in the earlier period without distortion, but we did. And Britain stuck the exchange rate against the dollar at $4.85, $4.85 per pound, and Britain was no longer competitive. The system just blew apart, and those who argue that that was a goodly part of what caused the Great Depression, I think, have good grounds. But the issue there, it wasn't the gold that was the problem, it was the people who insisted upon mispricing it. So what you had was free markets operating to undermine the gold standard because it didn't work. But nobody looking back in the 1870 to 1913 period has come up with the conclusion that it didn't work.
Well, it's funny you bring up that period, so I'll compare it to the century of the Fed. The Fed actually was enacted in law in late 1913, but it took effect 100 years ago next month. The 12 Fed districts opened their doors for business. The stock market was closed at that time. World War I was beginning. But the Fed has had a century now, and even though it's better than the British pound and the dollar has survived while other currencies have died, the consumer price index is up almost 25-fold. Gold is up 60-fold since then. So in what way would the Fed be considered a successful manager of the value of the dollar over the last century?
Well, remember what the Fed does what the Congress requires of it. When the Fed started out, it was still on the gold standard, and the gold standard basically ran monetary policy in the early years. The Federal Reserve was set up largely in response to the panic of 1907, and it was really an issue of a lender of last resort. Now, the lender of last resort issue is a very interesting one because there are those who argued for a very long period of time that we did not have a central bank from 1835 till 1913, and yet the economy worked remarkably well.
Right.
But the problem is that as you begin to get into what essentially has been a welfare state psychology, which is governed, it has basically governed societies now for, I would say, starting with in 1887, the ICC was brought into as a law. That is the first regulation of private intervention in the private market, and it was beginning to evolve. And so that the problem that you have is the fact that values culture, ideas, and philosophy determine what economic policies are all about. Unless and until you change that, nothing will happen. Remember, the two people who did most to change it, and only temporarily, was obviously Reagan, and actually to a greater extent Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher really took a moribund British economy, which was essentially an extension of what had happened when they tried to fix the pound sterling incorrectly. So it never recovered from that. And the two world wars decimated Britain. The crisis was so bad that Margaret Thatcher got in and made all of the changes that she did. And you must say about Britain is that many of Thatcher's changes are still there, and they're still adhered to. Many of Reagan's changes are there, but much less so. And it's difficult to find them as they disappear in time. It's ideas that matter, not economics.
Right. I'd like to get back to the 250 gold bottom in 1999 once again, because we have a lot of people who've sent in questions. As you can see, I've got quite a few written. And we went back to the gold newsletter and the speakers of the 1998 and 99 conferences. And so given the fact that you have said the Fed didn't sell gold, I wonder if there's any other kind of operation. And here's one I have. Back in 1998, Frank Veneroso helped research a gold book that said that central banks had been lending their gold holdings out to the bullion banks at low interest rate. And those banks were then selling the gold into the market and investing the proceeds into more speculative assets. Were you aware of any lending of U.S. gold supplies?
Not to my knowledge.
Not to your knowledge.
And if I didn't know, I can't figure out who did.
Well, you were also connected with IMF and BIS. Is there anybody in that, those units that might have done something like that?
Well, remember, the gold market has got an awful lot of lending, borrowing, and I mean, essentially, for example, the South Africans, for a long period of time, would sell their gold forward. In other words, they would basically, well before it was mined, they'd sell options against it so that their net reserve balances were very much larger than their actual gold. So that that process has been going on. I mean, I don't know what I'm trying to get at is gold is like any other commodity in many respects. And all of the derivatives associated with commodities are related to gold as well. So there's a lot of transactions that go on, but none that outside of the issue of the selling of gold by the central banks in a concerted manner, I'm not aware of anything of the nature that you're suggesting.
All right. Let's move past 9/11. You opened your book, Age of Turbulence. You were in the air in Europe, returning to America when 9/11 happened and you had to go back to Zurich. The whole world changed. Gold did have a 10-year bull market from that time until 2011, grew over sevenfold. There were also other things going on in the Fed, and this is what I want to ask you about. The interest rates remained very low from 2001 to mid-2004. The Fed funds rate was around 1% for a long time before, from 2004 to 6, your last years, the rates did rise up to about 5%. Do you regret in retrospect keeping rates so low, and might have that contributed in any way to the housing real estate bubble that began?
I know that is, let me just say this. What became very apparent after the dot-com boom was the fact that central banks had lost control of the long end of the market. In other words, the Federal Reserve and all the central banks could fix the short end, like the federal funds rate, but the yield on 10-year notes, they couldn't. And the reason is, it was basically what happened is that we began to see a huge amount of international arbitrage in the bond markets. And the result was that whereas periods before then, the 10-year note, for example, tended to really be determined by what the federal funds rate was, so that in that sense, the Federal Reserve and all central banks could control the price or the yield on the long-term debt. But that ceased after 2000. And the result of that was that the federal funds rate went down for a year to 1% because what we had been seeing was that the price level, inflation level was falling. That was an insurance act, as we were acting against the possibility of significant deflation, which we had seen arising in Japan, and we didn't like what we had seen. But that had nothing to do with the long end of the market, which just stayed up where it was. Money supply growth, long-term rates, all of the measures of inflation were unchanged. And what eventually happened is that you go back and you look at the data, you can't find the extent of what went on in 2003. And in fact, nobody raised the issue of 2003 at the time. And indeed, Milton Friedman, when I was leaving office, wrote an op-ed piece, the Wall Street Journal, praising Federal Reserve policy fairly significantly. It wasn't till 2006 or 2007 that there was a retrospective look back at what was going on at the Fed, and there was no contemporaneous arguments. It's all subsequent. It's only when the economy began to tilt that people looked back at that. But if Milton Friedman didn't see it, I don't know who in the world did.
Well, the Academy might not have seen it, but the headlines all over were these people flipping homes and borrowing and refinancing homes and turning them into an ATM machine. That must have scared somebody.
That had nothing to do with Federal Reserve policy. What that was, basically, is you had Fannie and Freddie in their, as I point out in the book, what happened essentially in that particular period is that Fannie and Freddie were, as you know, subsidized by the federal government, not legally, but they were essentially a clear, essentially everybody knew it was subsidized. And what happened was that because the government was not going to allow Fannie and Freddie to fail, that they could sell their debentures at an extraordinarily low level. And what Fannie and Freddie did as a consequence of that is once they recognized that, what they did is they sold huge amounts of debentures at subsidized rates of 30 or 40 basis points, and then reinvested them in mortgage-backed securities. Usually Fannie would invest in Freddie and Freddie would invest in Fannie, but they could have done it on their own if they wanted to. And what they were picking up is the government guarantee as the profits. And the profits of those two organizations skyrocketed. But most importantly, what they did was to build up their balance sheet, because unless they had assets, they couldn't sell the liabilities, which would give them the benefit of the subsidy. So they built up to huge levels. And then the regulations of HUD came into place, which essentially said, regulating Fannie and Freddie, which said that they had to put a significant amount of their existing balance sheet into affordable housing loans.
Right.
And so that there was this huge demand for mortgage-backed securities way beyond what was originally the case. I mean, I remember looking into the issue of subprime mortgages in their early stages, worrying about that, and then I called a lot of bankers and I said, are you subsidizing these things? What are you doing? He says, no, we're actually making money on these loans. Now, it is a little costly to educate the people in the mortgage market buying subprime mortgages about how to function, but we've had no problem with them. And indeed, it was a small group of the economy which couldn't afford the prime loans. They couldn't afford the 20% down payment, but they could afford a much lower down payment if the mortgage rate was fixed. And in fact, if you look back in that period, it was a small market, it operated efficiently, it was profitable to the banks to hold the stuff. But with this regulation, which then required Fannie and Freddie to boost up its requirements, they did, and what happened was that they reversed the process of where you do mortgages and then you securitize them. But Fannie and Freddie had gotten so large because they built up on the subsidy previously, couldn't do that. They had to buy securities as the only way to wholesale to meet the HUD obligations, which they then put pressure on a lot of their suppliers of funding, and they got them to issue many, many more subprime mortgages, but they could only be issued at adjustable rates. And the adjustable rates occurred because you'd get a lower rate, and a lot of the people could then, who previously weren't able to do so, bought them. So we had this huge buildup of adjustable rate mortgages, which were securitized, sold all over the world, and blew the system apart.
Yeah, I think we'll get into that some in our afternoon session with the other panelists too. But I'd like to turn now to the years after you left the Fed, which you wrote about in Age of Turbulence. We've now had almost 6 years of effective zero interest rate policy and not much measurable inflation. And I want to quote half a paragraph you wrote here toward the end. Thus, without a change of policy, a higher rate of inflation can be anticipated in the United States. I know that the Federal Reserve, left alone, has the capacity and perseverance to effectively contain the inflation pressures I foresee, yet to keep the inflation rate down to a gold standard level of under 1% or even a less draconian 1 to 2% range, the Fed, given my scenario, would have to constrain monetary expansion so drastically that it could temporarily drive up interest rates into the double-digit range. And they have done the opposite. The balance sheet has exploded, and yet rates have stayed so low, and inflation is not that measurable, and everybody's fearing deflation, if I believe the headlines. Could you please explain the map of this territory?
Sure. Money supply didn't grow. Observe what happens when the central bank buys securities. They expand the asset side of their balance sheet, and the holders of that at the point in which the transaction is made ultimately are holding reserve balances by commercial banks and savings banks and so-called depository institutions. So if you look at the Fed's balance sheet, in fact, you look at the ECB's balance sheet, the Bank of England, all the same. You get this huge increase in assets and huge increase in reserve balances. But money supply is not growing, and the reason is that very little, until very recently actually, very little of those excess reserves have been relent into the market to IBM or to General Motors. None of that has been going on, and the reason is that in the United States, the Federal Reserve, for example, pays 25 basis points to those commercial banks who are willing to hold the reserve balances. And because that 25 basis points is a competitive rate at the moment, they basically see no real need to re-lend it because they consider the market risky. There's huge uncertainty out there. So that so long as you're sitting here as we are now, with very little being relent into the aftermarkets affecting economic activity, and because of the fact that unless and until that is done, the money supply really doesn't accelerate. And if you take a look at the ratio of M2, for example, to the monetary base, it has come down to record low levels and it's stabilized very recently at very low levels. What this means is that we have this huge potential inflationary explosion tinder, but it's not been lit. And unless and until that happens, the Federal Reserve can sit there, as it has been for years, without anything occurring. The one change that I sense is happening is that we're beginning to see for the first time commercial and industrial loan demand in the United States beginning to move up. Commercial and industrial loans are not a big part of lending. I mean, actually, much less than mortgages. Mortgages are a big deal. Remember that money supply, M2, is the liabilities of commercial banks and savings institutions, and that has not, their balance sheets have not expanded, and as a consequence, you're not getting the extent of money supply creation that you ordinarily would. Ultimately, unless and until those assets are brought down before they get triggered into the marketplace, then inflation will eventually arise and has to arise. And indeed, I say that in the paperback of this new book.
The deflationists argue that Draghi and the European Central Bank charging 0.2% overnight to their member banks, trying to get them to loan out, is being exported over here since there are euro deposits, and so their U.S. customers have to be charged. And as you say, 25 positive basis points looks pretty good next to 20 negative points. So this gives the current Fed really a lot of wiggle room not to raise rates. And my theory is they don't want to raise rates because we have a $17 trillion budget deficit. If you go up to 3 or 4% average debt, that's going to hurt.
You know, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not the Federal Reserve policy is related to the interest paid on U.S. federal debt. There's more talk about that than there's actually ever been, as far as I can see. Any negotiations or...
Right.
I was at the Fed for 18 and a half years. There was never a discussion between the Fed and the Treasury Department on that issue. And I think that's more hearsay than anything else. But it is true that if you look at the budget deficit recently projected got revised down. Why? Because the interest rate forecast got revised down. And if interest rates really begin to move up with the size of the outstanding debt that we now have, the deficit could open up fairly quickly.
All right. Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and we'll continue in the afternoon, but I want to ask you about banks. You say 3 times in your book here that banks have failed terribly at regulating themselves, and that it's usually the whistleblowers that draw attention to it. I found a fascinating segment in your book, page 117, about the Resolution Trust Corporation in the early 90s. By allowing 474 savings and loans to fail, the net cost to taxpayers was down to about $87 billion when everybody was predicting $500 billion or more. Now we have this concept of too big to fail, which just doesn't sound like a logical statement. Anything can fail, no matter how big. What's your feeling on big banks and whether or not we should allow them to fail if they get into trouble?
Well, the problem that I have is that the purpose of a financial system, as I express in, I don't know, certainly in the paperback, it's in there when I discuss it in some detail, is to facilitate the movement of the society's savings into productive capital assets which create rising productivity and rising standards of living. To the extent that you divert, that you don't allow creative destruction to function, you do not optimize the use of the savings of the society. For example, if you prevent a large financial institution, for example, from failing when it otherwise would have, what's keeping that up is the savings of a society that would otherwise have been used to finance cutting-edge technologies and standards of living. So too big to fail is a remedy for stagnation. And the issue that people don't want to address is the fact that creative destruction is an essential characteristic of a market economy. It's an essential characteristic of capitalism, but it does have two aspects to it, creative and destructive. And people like the creative, but they don't want the destructive. And the problem that you have is the choices. You cannot have it both ways. You either have the high standard of living that you get by allowing the savings of the society to finance increasing productive assets, or you just finance everybody, creators or not, and by doing that, you're taking the savings that would otherwise be productively used and creating real serious problems in that. That's what's going on now. I mean, the issue of, if I may just go back to the Resolution Trust Corporation thing, you failed to mention the really important issue there, which we can't do anymore, and it's related to the same question. In 1979, when the crisis occurred, the Resolution Trust Corporation was organized, and its basis was to liquidate all of the assets of defaulting savings and loans, of which there were a large number, as you point out. The trouble that occurred as a consequence of that is that we had no difficulty in selling off mortgages and liquid assets. We did that very quickly. But then we were stuck with a whole series of assets like uncompleted 18-hole golf courses, which only 4 holes have been built, or contemplated 30-story office buildings half built. Yes. And what happened was, of course, the organization went bankrupt. So they were frozen. You couldn't, there were no bids. But remember that it's not just you don't only lose the amount that's involved in the value of the investment, but you have to tear that stuff down eventually because they will be a blight on the society. So that the federal government was caught with the possibility of a very major expense in not only liquidating the assets, but tearing down everything. Until somebody in the Resolution Trust Corporation, this could not happen today, and the reason I raise it This is a very important example. It's only 1979. He said, why don't we just package all of this illiquid stuff and put it into bundles and just throw it up for bid? And everyone said, in the process of discussion, it's a great idea. Of course, you know, the Congress will go berserk because you're only going to get 40 cents on the dollar, if that. And he said, well, look, that's what it's worth. And we already knew that if you have a market which is dead in the water and you sell into it, you will hit the low. I mean, the bid, you will get the lowest bid you could possibly get. And that's what was done for a couple of $1 billion packages. And lo and behold, the financial institutions, which we used to call vulture funds, bought them at the bottom and made a lot of money very quickly as they began to pick up. And everybody in Wall Street said, how long has this been going on? After having been zero bids for a very long period of time, Wall Street money came in and liquidated that inventory, and I think saved the American taxpayer, I would guess, $50 to $100 billion. Did they get credit for that? No. Could we do that today? No.
Yeah. Well, let me wrap up with a couple of very quick prediction questions, and then we'll continue at 1:30. QE is supposed to end this next week at the meeting. Give me your prediction of where short-term interest rates on U.S. dollar from the Fed will be 1 year from today.
I can't do 1 year, but I can do 5 or 8 years as I do in the book.
5 years from today.
I would say considerably higher.
Considerably. Is there a number there? A 3 or a 4 or a 8 or a...
Let me put it this way. I've been in the forecasting business for a long time, and I know how to create obscurity in answering questions like that. And
so that's why you do it.
I'm practiced.
Okay, final prediction. Final prediction, the price of gold 5 years from now. What do you think?
Higher.
Higher. How much higher?
Measurably so.
We will continue this conversation at 1:30. Please thank Dr. Greenspan.
Well done.
Get all my materials.